The Falcons are going back to a 4-3 defense, but what does that mean for their linebackers and corners?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Now, if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades. Formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast for well over a decade. And I appreciate each and every one of you that is going strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So today's episode, we are continuing our big picture conversation about what this revamped new look Falcons defense is going to look like. We broke down what, the wide 9 front is potentially is going to be on yesterday's episode. But today we'll talk, not about the front. Well, we'll talk some about the front, but we'll focus more on the back end and the linebackers. We'll talk about, Clark Phillips and Billy Bowman. Are they going to be the solutions at the nickel cornerback position? We'll talk about the Falcons corners may benefit from playing more man coverage in this scheme, but we'll start off talking about the linebacker play. And we have to make a distinction with this Falcons playing in this 4-3 defense and a wide 9 front with the notion that, 4-3 defenses aren't all created equal. All 4-3 fronts are not the same. There's a difference between what the Falcons are going to play, which we'll call a 4-3 stack or a 4-3 over front, which you'll hear both of those terms throughout today's episode, versus a 4-3 under front, right? And, the 4-3 under front is essentially a 5-man front with 5 guys on the line of scrimmage. A 4-3 over front is often a 4-man front. And I think a lot of people, have made the assumption that with the Falcons reportedly moving back to a 4-3 scheme, that they're assuming, they're going to go back to that 4-3 under front that was, what they ran for the 6 years that Dan Quinn was the head coach, back when Jeff Ulbrich served as the linebackers coach and at points defensive coordinator towards the end, as well as what the Falcons played when they had Ryan Nielsen as their defensive coordinator in 2023 when they were a 4-3 team. But as I discussed with Cody Alexander of Match Quarters a few months back, not every 4-3 defense is created the same. Not every front is created the same. And, that 4-man front with the Falcons likely playing a 4-3 over or 4-3 stack is relatively unique in the NFL. We talk a lot in the past about how fronts don't matter anymore because everybody runs hybridized fronts between the 3-4 and the 4-3. And that's basically what a 4-3 under front is. It's a hybrid scheme of mixing and matching what it's a 5-man front, just like a 3-4 defense would wind up being, but with 4-3 sort of principles. And basically the difference between what's a under versus an over front in a 4-3, it's really where the 3-tech lines up. 3-tech being the defensive tackle that lines up on the outside shoulder of one of the guards. And in an under front, the 3-tech lines up on the weak side of the defense away from the tight end. And in an over front, like the Falcons are going to play, that 3-tech lines up on the strong side, towards the tight end side of the offense. And basically in a wide 9, when you have those edge rushers that are basically designed to play the outside gaps, they're basically their responsibility in run fits is the D gap, right? That's outside the tight end. And they spill everything back inside. And so with an over front, you want your 2 outside linebackers who are playing off ball to basically be responsible to that C gap, which is between the tackle and the tight end. And the 3-tech is now responsible for a B gap in an over front, where in an under front, he would have been responsible for a C gap, the B gap being the gap between the guard and tackle. And, from what I can tell watching some of the film is that the Jets did occasionally run an under front, but for the most part, they overwhelmingly were running 4-3 over fronts in that wide 9 defense. And basically, again, one of the other distinguishing features between an over and under front, in addition to the 3-tech, is where the Sam linebacker lines up. right? In a 4-3 under front, that Sam linebacker, that strong side linebacker who lines up on the tight end side of the field, typically lines up on the line of scrimmage, right? Is basically an edge rusher that drops into coverage, very similar to a 3-4 outside linebacker. Now, in a 4-3 over front or stack front, that Sam linebacker lines up in a stack behind the defensive line, like the other off-ball linebackers, the other inside linebackers. And Troy Anderson is who I expect to play that Sam linebacker role, with Kaden Elliss being entrenched as the middle linebacker and Divine Deablo being entrenched as a starter at the weak side linebacker position. Right. And we talked about this last year where the Falcons in that second Saints game in week 10 last year dabbled a little bit with some 4-3 looks in midway through that game on a handful of plays where Troy Anderson was the Sam linebacker, Kaden Elliss was the middle linebacker, and Nate Lemon was the weak side linebacker. And they did a couple, like on 2 plays, I think had a 4-3 stack over front in those particular instances. And so, for the most part, it's not going to change a whole lot with the inside linebackers. Inside linebackers typically do the same thing in defense. It's just like, okay, well, now you're responsible for the A gap instead of the B gap or whatever it is. And now it's like, oh, one of the inside linebackers is going to be responsible for the C gap as opposed to the B gap, right? But for the most part, that's the thing that changes. And as we discussed on yesterday's episode, with the wide 9, everything's supposed to spill back into the interior, and that's going to force the linebackers to have to adjust. The D tackles are going to put more pressure on them, and we'll see if those guys can adjust. It'll be interesting. Reportedly, D'Angelo Malone is also getting some looks as that off-ball linebacker. I presume, if he does wind up making the roster, he'll be the backup to Troy Anderson at that Sam linebacker. But at the same time, part of me does wonder, is that a perfect opportunity to see if Jalen Walker will get some opportunities? Now, as we well know, Jalen Walker is expected to start out as a true edge rusher, defensive end in this 4-3 wide 9 defense. But part of me does wonder if later in the season, again, I don't think that's the initial plan, but later in the season, whether due to Troy Anderson not being available or other factors that may play out, that by year's end, will we start to see Jalen Walker get some of those 4-3 Sam linebacker duties when the Falcons play their base defense later in the season? So that is something to keep an eye on. As I'm in the minority of people that is like, I think there is a better than average chance that, Jalen Walker may not be a permanent edge rusher here in Atlanta long-term, but we'll have to sort of see how that all plays out this upcoming season. Obviously, the better he plays and the more productive he is as an edge rusher this year, the less likely that we'll see him, being moved to linebacker in order to get him, quote unquote, more opportunities on the football field. So that will be something that we'll probably worry about more in 2026 and 2025. But I do wonder if at some point in 2025, we start talking about that in earnest. But that's the basic overview of the linebacker position. As we get later in a week or two, when we get into more of our positional breakdowns ahead of training camp, we'll get into more of the weeds about why it may help or hurt certain players at the linebacker position, as well as, what we can expect about specific players. But that's just a general overview of how the linebacker duties are going to change in this 4-3, revamp 4-3 defense. And, people, if you can, Google what a 4-3 over is and read up as much on it. We'll talk more about it as the summer unfolds, but we'll continue today's episode talking about, the potential for this team to play a lot more man coverage and whether or not all of the Falcons cornerbacks should benefit from that. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Bonjour, mes amis. I come from France to interrupt your jour de l'abondance celebrations, to tell you about Game Time, to make sure you're ready to see my favorite countryman, Zachary Risachet, later this year in State Farm Arena. I know you stupid Americans love to buy your tickets last minute, and Game Time makes getting tickets to your favorite events faster and easier. Prices drop as it gets closer to tip off, and you can save up to 60% off with their killer last minute deals. Oh, you'll save so many euros, and with GameTime's better Rebex views. How do you say? What you see is what you get, and the price you see is the price you pay, with no hidden fees. Stupid Americans, we don't do that in France. Could you imagine paying hidden fees on escargot, fromage, or the Sauvignon Blanc? Sacre bleu! So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time by downloading the app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKED or in NFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So yesterday we talked about, the tendency of teams that employ this wide nine defense to run more middle of the field close coverages, typically cover one, cover three, which is basically to try to get that second safety in the run fit because of the way the style of defense makes it a little bit more vulnerable to the inside run, and having that second safety fit the run makes sense. And, is that DeMarco Hellam's music I hear? We'll get to the safety position later this summer. Again, in 2 weeks, next week, we'll be finishing the offensive line, or the offense with the wide receivers, tight ends, and offensive line. And then the week after that, we'll get into the defense ahead of training camp. But, DeMarco Helms is kind of flying under the radar a little bit because, based off of how the Falcons are going to play, it would not shock me at all if he winds up being the third safety, playing more snaps than Jordan Fuller versus, Xavier Watts and Jesse Bates being the top two safeties. So we'll see how it all plays out this upcoming season, but we'll dive deeper into that. But, because DeMarco Helms is more of that box safety is why I say all that. But when we talk about the cornerback room, that's what we're focusing on today. And we've heard Jeff Ulbrich talk about simplifying the defense. And one of the ways that you often see defensive coordinators when they say we want to play simply is that, we don't want our players to think. And the easiest thing for DBs when it comes to not thinking, especially in coverage, is playing man coverage, right? Where it's this is your man, you follow him and you stay in his hip pocket for the entire play. You don't have to worry about all the other stuff about zone and, matching and all this other stuff, right? And you saw that reflected in the Jets defense that they played a lot of man coverage this past year. According to certain things, they ranked 8th in man coverage, contrasted to the Falcons, who were 29th in man coverage. We saw this Falcons team increase their man coverage as the season wore on. Now, based off of my charting of the Falcons defense, I saw them play man coverage about 24% of the time. According to other sources that had them ranked 29th, they only played man coverage about 16% of the time. But when the Falcons did play their man coverage, based off my charting, they gave up a success rate of about 37% to opposing offenses. When they were playing zone coverage, it was a success rate of about 53%. And for the sake of comparison, the worst passing attack in the NFL last year, the Cleveland Browns, had a success rate of 37.1%. And the Bengals had the third best passing success rate last year with a success rate of 53.6%. So essentially, when the Falcons played man coverage, opposing teams played like the worst pass defense in the NFL. And when the Falcons played zone coverage, opposing teams played like the third best passing offense in the NFL. And obviously the conclusion is why didn't we just play man coverage all the time? And if you remember Super Bowl 51, that's why you don't play man coverage all the time, because you run out of gas. But certainly I think we all agree, and we discussed constantly last year, that we wanted to see the team play more man coverage than what they were doing. And they did do that as the season wore on, right? We can kind of separate the season, and at least in my opinion, charting the defense in terms of broad strokes of how they tended to play, into 3 buckets, right? Because you may recall going back to that week 6 game last year, when we broke down the film of that game, we talked about how the Falcons made some adjustments against that Panthers team that started to incorporate some of the Ryan Nielsen stuff that they were doing in 2023, more man coverage, dime defense, some of those factors that they weren't doing in the first 5 weeks. So to me, I think you can put the season into 3 buckets. The first 5 weeks of the season, where it was kind of like Jimmy Lake running his defense at its purest. Those middle 6 weeks starting in week 6, between then and the bye week, where you started to see the defense start to make some adjustments and doing some things differently. And then you had the post-bye, where it was clear that Raheem Morris had a lot more fingerprints all over the defense. And when you look at the man coverage rates based off of my charting during those 3 buckets of the season, right? The first 5 games, they only played about man coverage 17% of the time. The middle 6 games, that increased to about 23% of the time. And after the bye week, over those final 6 games, they played man coverage about 30% of the time. And I think ultimately, this defense and this cornerback room should benefit from playing more man coverage in 2025. Again, looking at my charting, AJ Terrell and Mike Hughes played really well in man coverage last year. Mike Hughes gave up a success rate allowed of 25%, which was better than AJ Terrell's 32%. And Mike Hughes had a forced incompletion rate in man coverage based off my charting of 25%. Now, for me, at first, and AJ Terrell was 18%. Now, a forced incompletion to me is basically when I'm charting the defense, right? And when I'm looking at why a pass wasn't completed, it's usually like quarterback error, like it's an off-target throw, a wide receiver error, like a drop, or another defender tipping a pass or something like that. And basically, anytime it's not one of those 3 things, I call it a forced incompletion by the cornerback, because presumably either the cornerback broke up the pass or their coverage was tight enough that it disrupted the receiver's ability to catch that football. And so, the fact that Mike Hughes, again, as you heard me say earlier this offseason when talking about Mike Hughes and why, bringing him back made a ton of sense, Mike Hughes arguably was better than AJ Terrell last year, at least in the handful of times that the Falcons were playing man coverage. Now, when you look at Dee Alford in man coverage and Clark Phillips in man coverage, Clark was solid, right? Clark's success rate allowed was 38%, which is a good number. And his forced incompletion rate was 25%. So matching Mike Hughes's, right? Dee Alford's a success rate allowed was 50%. And his forced incompletion rate was 17%. Now, if we look at those guys in buckets and look at how their man coverage success rate allowed was for the 3 parts of the season, Mike Hughes started out in that first 5 games at 50% success rate allowed. Then it moved to 28% in the middle part of the season, and then it was 13% after the bye week. AJ Terrell was 33% in the first bucket, 45% in the middle of the season, and then 21% after the bye week. Dee Alford, 67% in the first 5 weeks, 50% in the middle part of the season, and then 43% after the bye week. And then Clark Phillips had no targets in the first 5 games, so therefore gave up a success rate of 0%, but we don't count that. In the middle portion of the season, it was 33%, and then after the bye week, it was 40%. So clear indications that as the Falcons increased their man coverage, AJ Terrell and Mike Hughes seemingly got better, right? And that was also, I think, coincided. I couldn't find the numbers today, but previously looked up that the Falcons played a lot more press man coverage, particularly after the bye week as well. And even Dee Alford, the much maligned Dee Alford got better. So if you're one of the 3 people out there that's still holding on to your Dee Alford stock, you saw some improvement from his play. And so therefore, in theory, with the Falcons increasing their man coverage under Jeff Ulbrich, presumably, right? In theory, Dee Alford might be due for a bounce back season. Now, I know you're sitting there saying, Aaron, well, clearly your charting is wrong, because I watched Dee Alford get cooked with my own arms. And you're right. You did see him get cooked. I'm not lying to you guys. But technically, most of the times where Dee Alford was getting cooked is particularly against the Vikings and Washington. He was technically the Falcons, at least based off of my eyes, were in zone coverage. That's why his numbers in man coverage look so good, because every time the Falcons played zone, he was giving up 50-yard touchdowns, right? Now, it's interesting to me that Clark Phillips, as the Falcons increased their man coverage in the back half of the season, Clark Phillips' success rate allowed got a little worse. So you do wonder a little bit about that. But that gets us into the last part of the conversation, where we want to talk about the potential new options at nickel corner. If you're completely out on Dee Alford, as I know like 98% of you are, what do you think? You're probably wondering, what do you think could happen with Clark Phillips and Billy Bowman potentially taking over the nickel cornerback? And we'll break down whether or not those guys will benefit from playing man coverage as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So Clark Phillips is moving from outside corner to inside corner, and we'll see how that impacts his ability. Does that lead to better outcomes or worse outcomes, right? If you look at Mike Hughes, we know historically Mike Hughes has always been a better outside corner than an inside corner, right? If I go back to his 2023 charting of the defense, his success rate allowed primarily playing in the slot that year was 50%. But you saw that fall significantly in 2024 playing as an outside corner. And one wonders if Clark Phillips had put up pretty good numbers these last 2 years playing outside in man coverage, in both years giving up a success rate of under 40%, which is a good number for a corner. Will we also see his play dip by playing on the inside? And the reason why we can, again, I don't know if it's a safe assumption to assume that, but the reason why you would be concerned about that is because playing in the slot, in theory, is a much harder task than playing on the outside. Just because of the two-way go that wide receivers have. You have to cover a lot more space when it comes to man coverage, especially, as opposed to when you're an outside corner, you have the sideline to benefit you, as many of you have, I'm sure, heard. Some people like to refer to the sideline as the 12th defender, right? Because it limits where a player can go, right? And so it'll be interesting to see, Clark Phillips finally get a long look at nickel cornerback this summer and how that affects him. I've long been a person that felt like, Clark Phillips's future, if there was any chance that Clark Phillips was going to be a starter, and if you go back 2 years ago when I was breaking down Clark Phillips, I wasn't that high on his potential to be a starter for a lot of these reasons that I'm about to say. But if there was any chance of him being a starting cornerback in the NFL, to me, it was going to be as a nickel, because I just didn't think he had the size, speed, or length to hold up, as a full-time starter on the outside, right? And I feel like we've seen that play out over the last 2 years. He's been solid, as a backup coming off the bench, whether due to injuries or just to give the starter a breather. But, I don't think you can necessarily feel like, this is going to be our long-term solution, especially if, you hope that the Falcons go to much more of a man cover scheme where, size, speed, and length are at a premium when it comes to man coverage, right? So I think it'll be interesting to see if Clark Phillips. Now, the big knock on Clark Phillips is less about coverage. Again, we know Clark Phillips coming out of Utah was primarily more of a zone corner than a man corner. But again, because he's performed so well in the pros, relatively speaking, as a man corner, there's probably more ability there. But the big question about Clark Phillips moving to a nickel cornerback, is he going to play with the physicality that you need at that position, because of you need to be in the run fit, especially when you play in this 4-3 defense, or this 4-9 4-3 over defense, where you really need that cornerback to potentially impact in the run game, just because of how vulnerable you are to some of that interior run stuff that offenses are going to do. And is Clark Phillips going to bring it in that regard? And I think Clark is better than he was coming out of college when it comes to run support stuff, but is he good enough to get by as a full-time starter? Now, I think that's a big reason why the Falcons want a player like Billy Bowman to potentially win the competition, because in theory, Billy Bowman and his history as a safety, in theory, is going to bring a little bit more juice and a little bit more oomph in run support than either Clark Phillips or Dee Alford. But if you go back and you listen to my comprehensive breakdown of Billy Bowman back in mid-June, watching the college film, I do think that is an area that Billy Bowman is lacking. I do think he has the quote-unquote mentality. He has the, we'll call it the psychopath switch, right? That he, if he can flip that switch and play with a little bit more of a psychopathy to make up for his lack of size, because essentially Billy Bowman is like slightly bigger than Clark Phillips, right? He's like an inch taller, maybe a few pounds heavier, but has very similar length and wingspan concerns, very limited. He's just an itty bitty baby boy. And so like, you do wonder, for the same reasons we talk about with Clark Phillips, is that a guy that can hold up full time in run support in that nickel spot? I think Billy Bowman's a better bet than Clark Phillips in that regard, and probably a better bet than Dee Alford in that regard. Although Dee Alford hasn't been great in run support, but like, I don't think he's ever been a liability these last 3 years. But, last year was a rough run. So, that may not hold up under scrutiny if I go back and watch all his like run snaps. I might go back and look at some of my notes and be like, oh yeah, he missed a lot more tackles than I remember. But I was so distracted by all the 50-yard plays that he was giving up that him missing a tackle was no big deal, I guess you could say. But Billy Bowman, is kind of untested. Getting back on topic, is kind of untested when it comes to man coverage. Is he going to be able to hold up in man coverage, particularly if the Falcons increase the amount of man coverage they play? And again, how much they increase it? Like, I'm not expecting the Falcons to be a top 10 man coverage team, but I expect them to kind of meet in the middle. If they were bottom 5 last year and the Jets were top 10, then they'll probably be somewhere around league average this year. Is I think a reasonably safe bet that they will increase their man coverage. Maybe they won't go ham on man coverage, because again, part of the reason probably why the Jets were top 10, because they had Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed. And, no offense to AJ Terrell and Mike Hughes. I don't know if either one of, I don't think AJ is Sauce Gardner, and I don't think Mike Hughes is DJ Reed, but, maybe you guys have a different opinion on that. But, the one thing I'll say about Sauce Gardner is like Sauce did not care about run support. Go back and watch it. Like, this man was like, I am making business decisions. I'm about to get paid $30-40 million or whatever it is. I ain't tackling nobody. But that's neither here nor there. I know AJ Terrell also missed a lot of tackles, but it's not because AJ lacks the desire. Like, I don't think. Yeah. Anyway, we won't get into all that. Maybe we'll talk about that later. But getting back to the topic at hand, Billy Bowman, how will he hold up in man coverage? And I think that's an open question, right? Because if you look at his PFF grades, and when it comes to man coverage last year, it wasn't great last year. Like, he was like 40th percentile among like draft eligible safeties in 2024. Now, if you look at him, in the previous years, he was closer to 70th percentile in their man coverage grade in 2022 and 2023. And then when you look at PFF's yards per snap allowed while in the slot compared to not just the draft eligible guys, but all college safeties over the last 3 years, Bowman was 55th percentile in 2024, 65th percentile in 2023, and 48th percentile in 2022. So overall, over the last 3 years combined, consistently, for the most part, above average to above average, right? But nothing elite. And part of me wonders, like, given, the jump in competition to the NFL, where you're going to be facing some of the best wide receivers in the NFL, often at times working in the slot, do you need to be an elite college cover safety when it comes to the slot in order to be a good NFL nickel sort of guy? And we'll see, right? Because, like, to me, I just look around the league and I go, like, there aren't that many teams that have their quote unquote lead nickel corners or lead nickel players being safeties, right? And that's one of the reasons why I tend to be probably a little more skeptical than others that Billy Bowman is going to clear that. Like, to me, you have to be kind of exceptional to be a long-term answer at that position, because for the most part, NFL teams just realize, like, we'll just, we're better set putting an actual corner at that nickel cornerback spot because of how often, teams like to put their number one and number two wide receivers in the slot. They move these guys all around the formation, and most number ones in the NFL are going to spend at least a quarter of their snaps playing in the slot, and some number ones and number twos will spend half or more of their snaps in the slot. And, when you look around the league, like, unless you're like a Kyle Hamilton, like a safety, and even Kyle Hamilton is interesting because, like, Marlon Humphrey is the Ravens' primary, slot guy. And, Hamilton is their sort of second option. But for the most part, like, Hamilton also brings additional value beyond whatever he does in the slot. Like, what he does in the slot is really kind of the cherry on top rather than the main bulk of what he's going to do. And I think as we sit here today, I kind of feel like Billy Bowman, the main bulk of what he's going to be expected and asked to do, at least as a rookie, and we'll see how it changes in the future. Obviously, things can change, but like as a rookie, it's going to be primarily as a slot guy, because I just don't know if we're going to see him get the safety opportunities given the presence of Jesse Bates, given the presence of Xavier Watts, given the presence of DeMarco Hellams and Jordan Fuller. That I think he's going to be, way behind in that pecking order at the safety position. So if he's going to contribute to this team this year, it's going to be as a nickel corner. And again, I just have an open question over whether Billy Bowman is going to be the rare type of safety that can handle that opportunity. But we'll have to sort of see. Right now, I'm hopeful. I'm not necessarily optimistic, but I'm hopeful that he's going to be a situation similar to what we saw, a decade ago with Keanu Neal, right? Where, Keanu Neal, when he played at Florida, was not a guy that was asked to play a lot of man coverage at Florida. Like, he was basically, weirdly enough, a single high safety for the most part that occasionally would come into the box. And when he, pause, when he, you didn't miss it when Keanu Neal, did his thing. That's what I'll say. I won't use other words. But like, it was a question to me of like, it's can't versus didn't. And you've heard me use that before, where it's just like, when you talk about Billy Bowman, you talk about Keanu Neal in man coverage, and Keanu Neal was very good in man coverage for his first couple of years in Atlanta before injuries sort of, impacted that. But like it's a can't versus didn't, where it's just like it's not that Billy Bowman can't be a good man cover corner. It's hopefully that they just didn't ask him to be at Oklahoma, and there's untapped potential there for the Falcons to be able to mine, similar to what they were able to do with Keanu Neal being that tight end eraser, as effective as he was in those first couple of years in Atlanta prior to his injuries. And that's kind of the hope, it's for me, at least with the upside of Billy Bowman. But you've heard me say before where it's like, I kind of expect Billy Bowman to kind of be a stopgap at the nickel cornerback this year. We'll see if those expectations are correct or wrong. We'll talk more about, the ongoing competition, the 3-way competition, maybe even a 4-way competition, as we get closer to training camp and we do continue our positional breakdowns. Our next episode should be next week, as we look ahead more at the offense and talk more about the weapons and the tight ends. And, we'll see if I can avoid the Zach Robinson slander, but I discovered a new stat this week that is just like boiling my brain about Zach Robinson and how he used the tight end this week. And, I'll be breaking that down for the Locked On Falcons insiders this weekend with a film breakdown comparing, how the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Liam Cohen from the same coaching tree of Zach Robinson utilized 2 running backfield and utilized the tight end this weekend. Next week, we'll get into a film breakdown of what the Jets defense look like compared to this defense. So great time to become a Locked On Falcons insider by hitting that link in the description below. And you can sign up today and get a 14-day free trial. You can get those next 2 film breakdowns for free before having to decide if you want to pay $4.99 a month for future film breakdowns as the summer rolls on, and extended all 22 breakdowns and reviews that we'll be doing throughout the preseason and into the regular season. So that is all, potentially there for you as a Locked On Falcons insider. Again, at that link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. So hit that link if you are interested in that, or continue to just, hang out and listen to the podcast as we get you guys geared up for training camp. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And, if you want to get more of Zachary Resachet, go check out Locked On Hawks as your second listen. Brad Rowland's giving you the lowdown on all the big moves that the Hawks have made over the last couple of weeks, and big things are in store. I think I saw the odds on FanDuel that the Hawks have the 4th best odds of winning the East. Hey, what it do, baby? All right, so go check that out. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.